Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. I'm Natalie Palmer, Chief Game Changer at Quovita, who are an umbrella organisation for micro providers. Today's speaker is Simon Spoerer from CQC, talking to us about new ways of regulating care and sport. So this is hosted by the Q community, which is a special interest group called Reimagining Health and Social Care. It's convened by Jane Pipeling, who unfortunately couldn't join us today, and Matt Bell. And you can find more about us in the link at the top of the chat box. So the end time, I think we're aiming for about an hour. So 20 minutes for Simon to speak and go through his slides, and then about a 30-minute Q&A session. I'd like to introduce Matthew Mezzi. He is our technical support in the background. So if you have any issues with getting in, lost connections, give Matthew a shout. He is from Q and he's a co-founder of Enlivening Edge platform for next stage organisations like Birds.org. So please all mute your microphones unless you're speaking. And if you have any problems, you can dial in as well via telephone. So I will introduce Simon now. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. We do already have some pre-populated questions that we will go through afterwards. And yeah, that would be great if you could add them in there. So Simon is a design team leader in adult social care policy. He works for CQC, Strategy and the Intelligence Directorate. He qualified as a social worker in 1980 and he's worked in the field as social work manager for 9 years. He became a social care service inspector many years ago in 1989, and he's since worked for the inspection team. He's been a university lecturer and the last 10 years as a methodology developer and policy manager for CQC. He's led work on improving the regulation of care provided to people living in their own homes, and he currently leads on enforcement policy and is developing a proportionate new model for regulating micro-care at home enterprises, which is a really exciting concept that we've been working on. So I will hand over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Nat. Can someone just confirm that you've got the screen and you can see what I think you can see?
Yep, we can see.
Fabulous, right, okay. I think it's probably safe for me to assume that most people on this call, if not everyone on this call, is familiar with the Care Act 2014 and the impact that that has had on personal budgets and so on and so forth, and the stimulation that's given to organisations like Community Catalyst, hello Sean, wellbeing teams, the Birds.org and so on and so forth. So there's an enormous amount of creative thinking that's been stimulated, new service models for both unregulated and regulated providers. So the times they are changing. So this innovative modelling, these new approaches, new providers committed to models and characteristics like engaging and fostering locally co-produced circles of care, community networking, networking and building, the onion model, the gift relationships. There's an example of the circles of support at the bottom right there. There are lots of others, but they're all broadly similar. Amongst those have been proposals and ideas and developments around self-managed teams with distributed responsibility, by which I mean flat and not hierarchical arrangements where the knowledgeable manager tells everybody else what to do and everybody does what they're told. Mentoring and buddying rather than traditional supervision and training methods. Community building, strengths and asset-based approaches. And a lot of those are around making sure that people have got really profound levels of choice and control over what happens to them and how the personal care that they and other forms of support that they need are developed and delivered. Co-production, genuine co-production. A lot of them are exploiting the full potential of information technology in new and creative ways. And for many of them, that involves the service itself. I mean, in traditional terms, CQC would normally think in terms of a location with an office and bricks and mortar and all that kind of thing. And some of them don't have any, few if any bricks and mortar, online communities and so on and so forth. So I think it's fair to say that there's a view about CQC in some parts of the sector around regulation at its worst. And, you know, it's something in which I've got a degree of sympathy for. it gets in the way. It can be a distraction. It can disempower people. It involves complicated, hard to fill in forms that are only fit for large and traditional businesses. There are expensive fees to cover that don't actually gain you anything. The registered manager requirement is experienced as an inflexible burden. There are bureaucratic experience and qualifications requirements, both for managers and for staff. Too much emphasis on business structures and systems and policies and recording methods. It can be out of touch and inflexible, and there are out-of-date assumptions about things like supervision and what that means in inverted commas. We'll return to that theme a bit later on. It's about risk-averse hazard management that ultimately is used to control people. It blocks and impedes support and cooperation between care workers. And at its worst, it can be around nitpicking and people feeling like CQC is out to find problems, out to get them, get people in trouble. And those kind of, a lot of those have a foundation in some truth. And I am aware of some organizations that have had some pretty poor experiences, of real life experiences of going through the registration process. So that's the kind of background that I know a lot of people commonly feel about CQC, in particular amongst some of the providers in the micro provider and the informal sector, as it were. I suppose from our point of view, there are some risks and gaps. I don't think I would dispute for a moment, and I've seen some fantastic examples of unregulated arrangements working really well and of being really popular with people. But I guess there are some genuine legal constraints that can be hard for those providers to have to live with. There is a long-standing concern, not just in CQC, that current arrangements enable, or at least not enable, but they don't make it difficult or impossible for unsuitable people to get intimate access to people who can be very vulnerable. Well motivated, the best motivated of people, decent care workers who are working solely on their own without support, may not know what they don't know, which can be risky and hazardous for people. And they may not have access to experience and knowledgeable mentors and buddies. Where do people who get a bad experience go when they've got a complaint or a concern? Where it's an unregistered service, there can be nowhere to go if it's less than abuse, as it were. And there are taxation problems. I mean, I've heard accounts of users end up being declared to be employers and being given quite substantial tax bills. Rare, but it has happened. And some people actually do want a regulated choice. They would like to see a regulated choice in the micro provider marketplace. I'm kind of aware of that. I suppose at this point, it's really important that I say something really basic and vital, that we've got no plan or ambition to propose the regulation of personal assistance or of introductory agencies that don't meet current exemption rules. There aren't any changes that I'm aware of or that CQC is aware of for alterations in the regulations around that, either planned or coming. So I hope that reassures some people who might be a bit worried about that. So if we're going to get anywhere with proposals around making regulation attractive to a certain kind of micro provider, we've got to be experienced as an enabler rather than a barrier. What we do and how we do it is going to have a big impact on the ability of some providers to develop and adopt innovative models of care, not just from the point of view of micro providers, but also some things like, I don't know, online doctors and so on and so forth. There's an awful lot of new services emerging, making use in particular of IT systems and so on and so forth, that current regulatory arrangements sort of struggle with. We don't want to be a barrier to innovation, which is often actually more of an issue of perception, but anyway, there you go. So we wanted to look at how we could define good innovation, how innovation could happen in a good and creative way, and how we can adapt the way that we regulate so that it met those needs. So we worked with some providers and service users and partner organizations to understand what good innovation looked like. And we began a series of sandbox projects, one of which was this one, but there were others around things like online GPs and diagnostic services and so on and so forth. And all of them designed approaches to regulating that better supported and encouraged innovative providers. We created these sandboxing things. I mean, the word sandbox is a sort of an information technology thing. IT developers use it. It's where you create an environment in which you can experiment and play in a way which doesn't bring down the rest of the system. That's basically what it means. And we had a grant from the government to explore how we could apply it to health and social care and including to micro providers. It's also important that we understand, I think, the law as it stands. A lot of you, I think, probably do already, but it's worth rehearsing it. So providing personal care is regulated unless it's restricted to three things. Supplying care workers to other organizations, that's like staff agencies. Introducing care workers to clients, but having no ongoing role. The ongoing role thing is a quote from the Act, or the regulations anyway, in the direction and control of how the personal care is provided. And that's broadly introductory agencies. And personal care provided by an individual care worker who is, and this is a quote from one of the regulations, wholly under the direction and control, very similar to the other one, of the person paying for the service or a related third party like a close family member. And quite often those people are described as personal assistants. That's an informal title, as it were. It has no meaning in law, but that is the thing which covers social care personal assistants. And they also go by other titles as well. And as a result of all the sandboxing activity, no matter what happens to the project going forward, we are developing new guidance about what all this means in detail, because the sandbox itself showed that an awful lot of grey area organisations were developing and wanting to start getting involved in providing social care, and it was evident that we needed to give clearer guidance so that people could be confident about whether what they were doing was regulated or not. And that's currently out with stakeholders for comment, and things have been coming back about that, so that's good. You also have to understand something to do with how the law works here. We'll go through this really quickly. This is current legal requirements, and also how CQC organises itself as a result of that, which doesn't always help, as we will see. So the starting point is the Health and Social Care Act, and under that there's two sets of regulations, the regulated activities and the registration regulations. And the activities regulations are about practice and management requirements and the basics of how you provide personal care. The registration regulations are about how you apply and different provider types and the notifications about things that have got to be made. There are 14 regulated activities, one of which is personal care. And within CQC itself, we have 3 sectors and a number of different service types. One of the sectors is adult social care, and within adult social care, we break down services into residential services and community services. Residential is around care homes with nursing and care homes without nursing, and community services is around domiciliary care agencies, extra care housing, providers of care to people living in extra care housing settings, specialist housing, shared lives services, and supported living, providers of care to people living in supported living services. Now, micro providers don't easily fit into any of those, which is why when we opened the sandbox, we took a look at perhaps what we need to do is create a new service type rather than say that they're a kind of domiciliary care agency or whatever, because domiciliary care agencies have a particular way of working, and some people didn't want to micro providers to be seen as just ordinary domiciliary care agencies in inverted commas. So what we did was to play with various options and came up with a model based on, informed by, not based on, informed by the shared lives model. A lot of you will probably know in the early days of shared lives, in effect, it was a way of regulating micro care homes in a proportionate way, based on an awful lot of user and provider feedback about how the best to do that. The government responded very flexibly, created some new legal arrangements for the shared lives model, and we wanted to explore the extent to which that could or should be applied to micro providers providing care to people in their own homes as opposed to the micro care homes, or in daycare settings, which shared lives is also involved in. So the provider level, the body would be these, what we call umbrella bodies, who would recruit people who want to work in their local areas. I think the localism thing is really important, the community base, as paid carers in a co-produced way with people living in their own homes. And we made various assumptions about how those organizations would be likely to want to run themselves. For example, values-based recruitment would probably be a really important part of that. Values-based, I'm assuming I probably don't need to go into this in too much detail, but I mean, as Clinton Farquharson said during one of our sessions, I don't care what people's qualifications are and all the rest of it and what their experience is when I'm recruiting people. I want to know about them as a person. I want to know if their values fit with mine, that they're committed to various things that I think are really important. That's the starting point for me. And if they fit that, then I can teach them what they need to know. So a values-based approach to recruitment. And the umbrella body would take part in matching people who wanted to care at home service with people that they values-based recruited. And the umbrella body would retain a role in the co-production of the agreements about how care and support would be provided. And they'd also be involved in substantial reviews of that. The way that they would approach, that they would work would also involve substantial commitment to a mentoring approach around supporting care workers to identify and gain the new skills and knowledge that they needed, as they needed for the people that they were working with. And they would be committed to community networking, circles of support, asset and strength-based practice models, distributed responsibility, the sort of self-managed team model that I referred to earlier, with mentoring and learning approaches to risks and issues, and intervening where they had to. That's the umbrella body. I mean, ultimately, I saw some fantastic examples of, for example, the wellbeing teams. Took part in inspection of their service in Wigan. And broadly, where there are risks and issues, the team of workers together, the people involved in the thing, work out the solution with the person using the service. The umbrella body is only going to intervene if they can see some really substantial risks, normally by saying things like, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Again, inviting the participants to work on resolving them. But I suppose ultimately the umbrella bodies would retain the duty and the ability to intervene where things were potentially going to go wrong. So that would be a critical difference from the existing arrangements about introductory agencies who would have no ability or responsibility to do that. And I've got that sort of live applications down the bottom there. That's to do with the fact that in the sandbox itself, and I referred earlier on to sandboxes taking place in an isolated environment away from the main activity. Actually, in this sandbox, the applicants would make live applications for registration and would become registered with CQC. So in the sandbox activity itself, the first activity was around defining what the problem is with key stakeholders. And some of that stuff I've been through in the presentation around current perceptions and what people experienced. We then invited providers across the country to apply to join the Sandbox project in the context of published selection criteria. And six or seven providers were selected from that. We also identified a wider stakeholder group and identified and recruited them. There was an awful lot of networking activity with a wide variety of different organizations and people. We then had 2 scene setting workshops where we discussed and refined the characteristics of the new service type. We've created a project handbook which covered a description of the service type, what it would need to do to apply for registration, all that kind of thing. And we got to the point where providers were developing and submitting real live applications for registration using a new application form which was developed for the sandbox itself. And then we had the pause due to COVID-19. This was around about March when CQC suddenly found itself with some very severe risks and issues that it had to resolve, and policy resources, including myself, had to be diverted on. So I've just said the first thing there. The resources remain an issue. We've got major new policy team commitments, and I'm due to retire. I'm heading towards retirement in in November, which is not a way of saying we're going to stop the sandbox and we're not going to do it again. I mean, sadly, this meeting is taking place before we've made a decision about that, so I can't tell you what it is. I literally don't know what it is. I don't know. But we're currently gathering and analysing the learning that there was. We will be having some discussions with the various providers involved, and some of them have already been in touch with us to express considerable enthusiasm for it to carry on. And that will inform our next step decision. Well, the options are there. We continue to develop the new service type and to trial it in the way that we were planning to do. The other option is that we adapt and develop the current domiciliary care service type in a way that makes sure that it can better respond to the needs and circumstances of the kinds of providers that we've been talking about. And I have to say, I'm glad to say that where wellbeing teams had a pretty awful experience of registration some time ago, I've been in touch with some providers since who have actually had a very good experience of registration, partly because of this project and the learning that we passed on to registration inspectors. So they've had a good experience of registration, but all the while in the knowledge that the registration inspector was banging a round peg into a square hole while they were doing it, and leaving some people with considerable anxiety about what they were going to experience when their first inspection came. If it helps anyone with anxieties about that, I mean, I'm glad to say that wellbeing teams, after their appalling experience of registration, where it really was, they felt like being banged into a square peg round hole thing, they ended up being rated in outstanding in their very first inspection, which is almost unheard of. And that's because they had an inspector, and I worked with that inspector as well, who was very flexible and thought carefully about what they're doing and was able to adapt current expectations and regulatory requirements to fit their circumstances. So that would be the other way forward with that. So that was our options, and I've got to the end of my sort of chalk and talk bit. So Natalie, how would you like to do the next section?
Thank you, Simon. Very informative. So shall we go through some of the questions that came up before, and then go with any new questions we've got?
Sure.
So first question was from Victoria Sample. So small providers do need extra support, but can offer very good care, as you said in the talk time. How can CQC support them with registration?
I suppose we need to know more about what we mean by small providers. If we mean very small domiciliary care agencies with a small number of carers, I think the record shows that we have been able to adapt our regulatory approach, and in fact to larger providers as well. Wellbeing teams are not a small provider. We have been able to adapt to meet their needs, and we have an outstanding rating after that. So that shows that it can be done. I suppose if you're talking about micro providers, well, you know, we struggle with that, which is one of the reasons we wanted to have the sandbox, why we proposed a potential alternative way of offering support to micro providers working on their own, who would be able to come together as a team working through the umbrella body. There's no block on that happening if we make either a new service type or we adapt the current service type to encompass that approach. There really is no block to that happening. We have been able to propose, and we were about to test that approach. So I'm optimistic it could be done.
I think it's important to point out as well, something that came up in the sandbox workshops we did, that even though this is a new form of working, we cannot change the law overnight, which some people thought we possibly could, and that there would still need to be a registered manager in place with these umbrella bodies.
There would.
So there will still be an element of the traditional DCA to start with, because we cannot change the law and that needs to be in place. So with the umbrella organisations, there will still be the registered manager overseeing everyone that is under that umbrella until such a time, and obviously that's going to be not in the near future, particularly with COVID thrown in the mix, but something that we were aware of and will need to be looked at a lot further down the line.
Yes, well, you're absolutely right. There's no way we can get around the registered manager requirement. It's a fundamental, and there would have to be one.
Yeah. Okay. Next one from Christine O'Connor. Would Simon like to visit a successful micro enterprise which proves what he is suggesting? Would welcome his visit to accelerate.
I'd love to do that, and I have done already with some. It would be good to see some more. In the context of my leaving in the next 6 weeks, it might be tricky and the COVID restrictions, but it would perhaps be a good idea if we could set up a Zoom or a Teams meeting, and you could introduce yourself to me and take me through what you do and what the differences are, and I would welcome that. So I don't know whether you can connect us with email addresses, but that would be good.
Yeah, I've got an email address there, so
Great.
I'll do that. I've also, during this time of lockdown and COVID, been made aware of a lot more. Obviously, there were 6 of us involved in the first place that got chosen to do the sandbox, but there's been a lot more come out of the woodwork during COVID, quite a surprising amount. So I'm sure there'll be a lot more people who would like contact to talk about the way forward. Liam Cahill, with ICS models moving towards consolidation, how would this avoid the economies of scale issues that smaller entities face?
And that would be integrated care systems, would it?
I think so, yeah.
Could you read the question again? I'm not sure I understood it, to be honest.
With integrated care system models moving towards consolidation, how would this avoid the economies of scale issues that smaller entities face?
So, do we imagine the question means smaller enterprises aren't able to engage or benefit from the economies of scale that some larger providers are thought to be able to benefit from? Is that what we think this means? Because I don't know that I would recognize the fundamental premise, to be honest. I would say that small providers and bodies that support them are often able to organize themselves in highly efficient, low-cost ways, just different ways. I'm not sure. Sean, can I invite you to say something about this? Because I have a feeling you might, yeah, am I right that as far as I'm concerned, the basic question's got a flaw?
Well, I think it is assuming, I mean, our experience, particularly in Somerset, hello Natalie, by the way, is that you can achieve scale by, 500 very tiny enterprises delivering care to large numbers of people across so scale in that sense. In terms of economies of scale, the business model of very small providers is very different to the business model of large providers. They've got limited, if any, infrastructure. They don't have shareholders. And so I think there's a kind of an assumption that small providers are inefficient and large providers are efficient just because of size. And I think actually you're comparing apples and pears, aren't you? Comparing large providers have a particular business model and particular challenges around scale, which is very different to the micros. So would you say, is that what you would agree with, Simon, or not?
Yeah, well, that was what I was thinking. I just wanted to know if it sort of fitted with your experience on the ground across the country. I mean, also, from a CQC point of view, we're not a kind of financial agency. We don't regulate fees. We don't regulate commissioning and all that sort of stuff. So we're relatively blind to all of that stuff. I mean, that said, of course, we have to be aware of potential impact. We know, for example, that social care at the moment is an extremely fragile state. We've said so time and time again in our state of care reports, and we say so time and time again, informally, to the government. If they haven't heard that, both from us and from other sectors, it would be strange. But I would have thought that, and well, Sean has already said what I said, so I won't repeat it.
I was just going to add, really, that I think there is a resilience in many small providers providing a service that isn't in one large provider providing the same service, so that if one particular micro provider for whatever reason stops their service, it will affect a very small number of people, and that slack is usually taken up by other micro providers in the area. So I think there's a very different resilience built into this kind of model.
Yeah, I think as well, going back to the local thing that we're really supporting, I think as the umbrella body's going through this first sandbox and registering, we learn an awful lot, and then we can support the other micro providers to scale up and potentially become their own umbrella body further down the line. So there is that potential to scale out. You know, it's not just a case of this was a test to see how it would work for the first 6 and then to open it up to others further down the line. So, you know, potentially that's where that can happen. So we go to the next question, which was Alexander Ankra. How do we support cultural sensitivity as part of framing better care given our demographic change?
I'd have thought that was a question that applied to any service, not just to micro providers. And I guess one of the benefits of the micro provider approach is that if it's as anticipated, based on providers in their own communities providing a service to others in the same community, then the potential that they have for being wholly more reflective of the circumstances of their clients is going to be pretty much enhanced. I mean, I guess that's a bit of an ideal, but I from what I've seen about how it works in practice, it does work. So that would be my broad answer to that question. But I think, you know, it's incumbent on all providers of whatever size to make sure that they've understood the demographic circumstances of everybody that they provide a service to, and that they're really sensitive to it and are alive to it and keep it as an open question at all times.
So Laura Collins, I'm not sure what, SDS for family carers, finding PAs where there is no online official vetted network of self-employed care workers.
Right. I'm not sure what the question is.
I'm not sure what SDS is.
Okay, so I imagine it might be about, and there are some really successful schemes across the country, broadly run by trading standards organisations or vetted or part of trading standards arrangements in some councils, some shared across councils and so on, who have recruited people in a sort of umbrella body type way, but without retaining the other responsibilities and activities that I was talking about in terms of ongoing role in care and support going forward and all that kind of thing. And they've done really well, I think, in making sure that the list of vetted and accredited in inverted commas is available for people who want to buy a personal care service from a personal assistant kind of approach. I guess the trouble is that not all parts of the country, as the question hints, have got that. And so I would completely agree that in the parts of the country that don't have access to a sort of credible vetting scheme for personal assistance, there can be significant risks for people.
Can I also answer that question as well? Because I do actually have part of the answer. So during COVID, we have actually designed an online register for self-employed carers in line with what we've learnt from the sandbox. So that is enabling us to build a framework and vetting carers, and they are able to showcase their work and what they are doing. So that is something that is happening and is getting launched, that will be available UK-wide. So there is, and I know that there is things going on in various places where there is registered. So it is something that does exist and is being built on.
I guess the difference is the sort of thing that we were looking for in the sandbox was that it wouldn't be just about vetting and presenting people with lists of people that had met certain, I don't know, vetting requirements, but that there would be a continuing relationship, which is the thing which can be difficult to achieve at the moment for personal assistants.
Natalie, there are a couple of questions from Jeremy Cox. If you want to, maybe he could kind of pitch in with his 2 questions.
Yeah, Jeremy, do you want to unmute yourself? And
yeah, hi Simon. Just a couple of hopefully fairly straightforward ones. I think both are relevant in terms of your impending departure as well. And good luck with your retirement is the first thing to say. The first one is, to what extent is the sandbox approach being adopted more widely in CQC? I didn't pick it up in any of the recent CQC Strategy 2021 webinars, so I just wondered kind of how big it was and how widespread it was within CQC, and perhaps the extent to which we can help CQC do more of this. Well,
we, like other organisations, are in a tricky place at the moment because COVID has driven our coaching horses through a number of plans. And broadly at the moment, we're developing, without wishing to go into too much detail, spend too much time on it, what's called a transitional regulatory approach, i.e. how are we going to regulate providers at this time until we have developed a more permanent approach, not just in the context of COVID, but also in the context of wanting to be a much smarter organisation which focuses things where we need to be more data driven, more clever in how it collects data, all of that kind of thing. Now, I don't know the extent to which the word sandbox used or not used. It sounds like it wasn't used in those things that you attended. I wasn't there myself. But what I do know is that the sandboxing committee, the group of people in policy and strategy with support from operations and intelligence and so on within CQC, is still very much alive. Because I have to write a report for them very soon, and they're very interested to know what the proposals for going forward are. So I don't know in detail because I'm not that part of the organisation, but the sandboxing thing is still very alive in principle, and I would be surprised, very surprised, if the approach wasn't adopted and continued going forward as a means of testing new models and how to regulate them.
Well, thanks. And a second very quick question, which is linked to that, was for providers or organisations that are keen to stay connected, get involved, be part of exploring that with CQC. How do they contact? Where to start?
You mean in terms of this particular thing, the sandbox around micro providers, or sandboxes in general?
Yeah, both.
Well, sandboxes in general, look out for announcements as they're made, as they were with this one. And you know, if you're a registered provider, you get bulletins. If you're not and you signed up for our bulletins, you'll get them. So sign up if you're not part of it. As far as this sandbox goes, I mean, like I said earlier, there'll be a decision in the very near future about how we're going to take it forward. So look out for that.
All right, cheers, Simon.
Sean, just answering your question quickly, it does allow self-employment among its carers. Because that's the model we're working towards, and there's quite a few others involved in the sandbox with the self-employment model. We're just looking at obviously we have to please HMRC, CQC, everyone else. We're on that fine line. We quite like being on it, but we do have to make sure that everything works correctly in that way. So as Simon said, we don't get slammed with big tax bills at the end of it.
Well, indeed. And it is a very fine line, isn't it, Natalie?
Yeah.
I did wonder whether the oversight of the umbrella organisation might tilt people, self-employed people, off that fine line. But
we definitely don't want it to tilt and not enable self-employed carers. Yeah, it is something we have to look into and carry on the conversations.
It just might be worth having. We had a big issue in one of the areas we work where there was an interpretation, I think, from the Inspector's Tax Manual, which has a page, as you know, on personal assistance, that that personal assistants could never be self-employed, and so and there was a ruling from the regional status officer that actually, in the case we were talking about, which was this very fine line, where people are totally independent, set their own fees, decide who they're going to offer a service to or not, and manage that service themselves, that was fine. It just might be worth having, just making sure, because it's such a grey area, isn't it?
The handbook that we wrote up includes some content on this. It's tricky for us because we can't set ourselves up as tax experts.
No, no.
What we do in effect is to put some really clear warnings about the potential for dilemmas and risks and problems around taxation. We've got some links to where you can find out more about it. I mean, and clearly from our point of view, it would be an absolute disaster for people to end up being declared an employer when they thought they weren't, and carrying all the potential problems that would arise from that. And it's not just tax either. The arrangements for the gangmaster stuff, which sounds awful, doesn't it? But anyway.
No, I mean, all that employment law stuff, absolutely.
The employment law stuff is separate to the taxation stuff. And actually, the Department of Business, Enterprise Skills and all the rest of it have a different approach to self-employment to the taxation people. So we've also provided some information and links about that. So from our point of view, we don't really care whether people are self-employed or not. It makes no difference to us in CQC. Our laws, our regulatory focus is about different things. But we're just saying to people, you have to be absolutely confident you've got this right. If you end up causing problems for people, that will be a problem. That will be unacceptable.
Yeah. I think you have introduced something in the umbrella organisation which is great, which is around oversight and matching, which it just might be worth having a broader conversation with one of the regional status people. Natalie, there's a really good one. You're Somerset, aren't you? And there's a really good status person who could help think it through.
Yeah, because you can go online and put in all the answer the questions, and each time it will come up with
different answers.
Yeah,
and it's such a grey area. I just think it might be worthwhile having a conversation about that.
I mean, I had lengthy conversations with Business Enterprise Skills and also with taxation on what do they call it, HMRC. I mean, HMRC's position is that the relationship between the customer and the provider is sort of like a partnership. Then, you know, they could contemplate the idea that it was a self-employed situation because, you know, if you're self-employed, you're not acting, as it were, under the direction and control of the person purchasing the service. You're coming to an agreement with them as equals, in inverted commas, which kind of, you know, in a sense, it sounds good, but it runs contrary to the thing about people being in control of their own lives and exercising direction and control. So that would be for the provider to work out. From our point of view in CQC, just get it worked out. We don't regulate.
The umbrella organisations, I suppose it's worth them being able to.
And there's many discussions with many lawyers and many people. But yeah, it's you know, we're looking at two-way, three-way agreements we can have, how, you know, how all that's going to pan out. And we don't know yet because at the end of the day, it hasn't been written.
Because the shared lives people have reached an understanding with HMRC. I mean, one of the things which we hoped would happen in the, you know, if the umbrella body thing took off, was that some sort of national organisation might develop to provide a kind of national lobbying centre and developing the model and the approach and all the rest, who may be able to then have some discussions with HMRC. But then that's for the future.
Well, we've got a bit of that role just because of our membership organisation, but which is kind of why I'm talking about it, because I think there is the shared lives families use their own homes to provide their service, and that gives them a very different tax position to community micro enterprises who are not. necessarily using their own resources. So it's a bit of a more complex area. Anyway, it is for. I just thought I'd raise it. I'm going to shut up now.
I guess it also goes on to our next question from Sarah Rothwell of how do you go about setting up micro enterprises to deliver personal care? Do self-employed PAs need to be CQC registered?
Well, no, they don't. The regulation is quite clear. At the beginning of the presentation, there were the 3 exemptions. Where a personal assistant is working under the sole direction and control of the person who's buying it or their family. It's not just that person. Sometimes with cognitive difficulties, it might be a family member. If they are acting under their direct control, there's no other person with a say, as it were, directing things, then that is exempt from registration. However, if they are working with an organization or an individual who is exercising continued direction and control, and the new guidance that I talked about includes or provides examples of what that means in concrete terms, then it would be a registerable activity, though the personal assistant themselves may not be the thing that's got to register. It might be the organization or individual who is exercising a degree of control over what happens. So when this guidance is out, and I'm anticipating it being out in the very near future, I've had a fair amount of feedback and it's all been broadly positive, which is good, but there have been suggestions. I've got to incorporate and think through these suggestions for the guidance, and then we can publish it, and then people will have a really good idea about whether they need to register or not.
Yep. Okay. Stephen Medley, the delivery of care via platform-based approaches, i.e. introductory agencies. That's not actually a question, it's more of a statement. So I'm not quite sure what...
Yeah, well, it's probably, it's a useful time for me to say something about the platform thing, and that's a bit of jargon, I suppose. I mean, for me, it doesn't matter whether it's computer-based or paper-based, it's all the blooming same. It's a question of who's organising what's going on, not how they're organising it, whether they're using computers to do it or writing letters with a quill pen. It's if you're exercising control over what happens, if you're influencing what happens, then you are taking part in how personal care is provided. And you can be in a provider role there, which means that you could be liable, or you are not exempt from registration. It's something to be very careful about. But whether it's computer-based or paper, it really doesn't matter.
I guess that brings our tagline in of you can systemize the predictable, but you humanize the rest. Yeah. You know, it's that element, and if you're completely platform-based, it's very difficult to become registered, because if you're covering such a vast area, how is the localization going to work? And with the registered manager, how's that going to work with relationships ongoing to be able to monitor what's going on? So there has to be some human element to it, and it can't all be platform based.
I don't know how that would work in the context of the sorts of teams that I'm on about, because if it's about mentoring and relationship management and being truly supportive to people, I don't know how you can do that from hundreds of miles away. However, there are a number of organizations that are registered with us or are considering registration with us that do provide a national service effectively using a variety of different platforms and methods and approaches. But that's not really what I'm talking about in terms of the sorts of teams that we were anticipating with the model as it was developing.
Yeah.
Yeah. The old location thing, an office with a desk in it and a computer, it's really it's disappearing remarkably quickly. We've already responded to that. When you change where the office is, you don't need to apply for re-registration anymore in the way that you used to. We are trying to catch up with it and doing quite well as well.
Yeah. So that, I guess, answers the next question from John Sutton of how can inspections be done more virtually?
Oh, well, that's a huge question. I've actually been working on virtual inspections for a little bit, including of domiciliary care agencies. One of my colleagues, Lara Nuttall, has been working with operations colleagues to develop just such a thing. It would only happen where risks were low and demonstrably low, but they are working on it, and there is going to be a pilot of this in the autumn. So that's going to happen, but it's not just about micros. Sorry, are there any more questions?
A strange one that we can't answer because we don't know about COVID. Is it likely for reinfection if one has been infected before? Well, I'd say we're not COVID experts, so we don't know the answer to that right now.
I was just reading an article which suggested that yes, it is possible, but
yeah,
that's not what we're here to talk about. I suppose, to return to what we were talking about, I'd be interested to know what other people thought, really. I mean, you've heard what I've been going on about with this model. I think that there is, I'm really, really pro the local community-based things. And I'm really enthusiastic about what organisations across the country have been able to achieve with it. It's been phenomenal to hear about it and to see the successes they've had on the ground. I'm conscious that registration as it currently stands and inspection as it currently stands isn't well suited to their circumstances. We've been thinking about ways in which we can better suit it, which is what this is about. Do people think that, yes, there is scope for a truly local but nonetheless regulated model that would be inspected, that would be a choice for people, or are we just wasting our time?
Well, hello, I'm Simon Fenton here. Yeah, I do definitely feel there is a place for it, Simon, and I think partly because if you're in this space and you're a micro enterprise or potential umbrella, you need all the help you can get. It's a huge health and social care system. The very fact that it's recognised as a regulation area would give organisations like ours some traction to actually go down this route and invest some money in trying to create a personalised approach to supporting families and vulnerable people. So I think from that aspect, it's absolutely critical. There's lots of stuff around social prescribing, lots of wellbeing stuff, lots of stuff happening with GPs, there's PA registers, but I think it hasn't happened, and partly I'm not sure why, but I just think regulation would be one way of giving us a little bit of a hand up to really explore this space and develop these sorts of models. It needs to be neighbourhood or localised, and I think that's the issue for us. I think if we're to go down this route, the current regime of regulation is just so big that it's almost meaningless to us. So I think, the work you've done is absolutely spot on, and I think it's time well spent, and we would be very interested in trying to deliver something locally in Brum based on this model. So no, please keep going, guys, and I think it's fantastic, and I think we do desperately need these new models, and I think regulation is one way of sort of almost helping the promotion of new models of working.
I think a lot of what I've talked about could actually be achieved by traditional domiciliary care agencies as well. I mean, with any approach, I suppose, there's inbuilt conservatism, reluctance to change, and all the rest of it. But there are some really fantastic domiciliary care agencies around there as well, or agencies that describe themselves as domiciliary care agencies or care at home agencies, who don't shy from the term, but just do it in a different way, in a much more responsive and person-centered way. And for me, I suppose the wider agenda is, how can we help domiciliary care, in inverted commas, traditional domiciliary care, traditional ways of working, the 15 minutes and all the rest of it, how can we help people, how can we help them to modernize and become far more person-centered?
Well, I think the issue is you're completely governed by the culture of the dom care agency. Yeah, there'll be some that are great and personally centered, and have good practice. But I think if you turn the model on its head and you've got people that are interested in providing care within their neighbourhood, they can direct their own time, they're self-employed, all of a sudden their status goes through the roof. So I think great, you'll get some good dom care agencies, but I do think there is scope for new models, and I'm not sure the current regulations would allow the flexing of the self-employed to deliver, you know, stuff to their local neighbourhoods, their local neighbours, their local community at that level. I think dom care do work on a basis of scale and have a totally different business model that would hamper some of the personalisation we're after.
Yeah, okay. I see we've got some colleagues from Berksorg on the call. I've had discussions with them and it's been really interesting. I hope we've convinced you that it is more than possible for self-managed teams to survive in the world of regulation. Are you with that or not?
Absolutely, Simon. Yeah, and thank you for the presentation today. No, we absolutely, we had, in fact, just last week, we did a really interesting and stimulating and interactive workshop with CQC colleagues, about 25 of your colleagues right across the south from Kent to Cornwall. And the mood I got from that was very much that there's not only a willingness, but a determination to live up to much of what you've been saying about enabling rather than preventing or undermining all sorts of innovation, including of the kind of neighbourhood care that Buurtzorg supports in the Netherlands and intends to support in Britain, and the kinds of changes that we're supporting NHS and local government and social enterprises to do here to become more person-centered, relationship-based, and operate through self-management. So yeah, I'm encouraged not only by what you say, but what I've seen from others in the CQC in our conversations with them.
That's great, good. So Nat, I've just seen the time actually, and I suppose like other people, I've got to go.
Can I just ask one last question from me?
Yeah, sure.
What have you taken? Have you taken anything from the initial sandbox, the workshops we had? Have you taken any of that knowledge that you learned there and used it to help register the Nightingale registrations during COVID?
It didn't apply to Nightingale because, I mean, clearly that was a health service and there's a different approach to health service registration. So it wouldn't have helped with the Nightingales. I mean, obviously, we registered them very quickly at pace. It needed to be done in the context of the time and what was happening at the time, because as it turned out, the Nightingales were hardly used. But I think it was a great example about how the entire sector, including us as regulators, pulled everything out and got something going in remarkably short time. That was good. Yeah.
Okay. I think that's all the questions. If anyone's got any others or any further information they want, I'm happy for you to contact me and I can pass on to CQC. So we do have a group that we're all part of. And I'm sure Simon will be happy to get all your questions answered before he runs away. Or maybe you could semi-retire and come over to the dark side.
My ambitions involve sailing and motorcycling, actually.
Oh, sounds lovely.
But thank you for the invite.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time,
I'll
Simon.
See you all soon.
It's been great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie.